All right, I'm letting our last person in and we will begin. So good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Samantha Kulish-Fargione, and I am the Executive Director of the Weston Historical Society in Weston, Connecticut. And it's lovely to see so many people joining us from all over Connecticut this evening. Thank you so much. Now, before we begin, just some light housekeeping. We are recording this presentation this evening, and we will be making it available on the Weston Historical Society's website, as well as on our YouTube page and our Facebook page. And we will also email you a recording by the end of the week. We kindly ask that you keep your microphones muted and your cameras off during the presentation. Now, if you're seeing sort of a bunch of little boxes on your screen, we encourage you to change your Zoom screen view so it's only on speaker view. And that way you'll only be looking at the presenter and the slides. That function can be found at the top right of your screen if you're using a desktop or laptop, and at the top left of your screen if you're using an iPad or tablet. Now, I want to just reiterate, we will be taking questions and answers at the end of the presentation. We will be using the chat feature, and many of you have used that already to let us know where you're tuning in from. Just to remind you, it is at the bottom of your screen if you are on a laptop or desktop, and it is at the top right-hand corner of your screen if you are on an iPad tonight. And what we'll do is at the end of the presentation, I will go through and read the questions to Christine, and she will answer them. If you'd like to help the Weston Historical Society continue its community programming, please consider making a donation at the end of tonight's lecture. We're a 501c3, and you can visit our website to donate and to learn more about our other programming. So as a lead-in to the Weston Historical Society's upcoming exhibit, Weston Slept While the Nation Roared, Life in the 1920s, which will open later this spring, we're organizing a series of virtual lectures that will explore events that influenced and shaped the Roaring '20s. And tonight, we will explore a monumental event that had a direct impact on the 1920s, and that is World War I. We welcome Christine Pittsley, who is the project director for the Connecticut State Library's award-winning World War I program, to educate us tonight on Connecticut's vital role in the Great War. So Christine has been the project director for the Connecticut State Library's World War I programs, which include Digging into History, a trench restoration project, and Remembering World War I digitization program. She was Connecticut's liaison to the United States World War I Centennial Commission and has been recognized as a leader in the nation's commemorative efforts. She has worked at the State Library since 2008, created and led the archival and museum digitization and metadata programs. She's been involved in a number of statewide digital initiatives and serves on the Connecticut Militia Heritage Council and served on the boards of the Association for the Study of Connecticut History, the Cheshire Historical Society, and the Cheshire Historic District Commission. So without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Christine.
Thank you so much, Samantha. I am so excited to be doing this presentation again. It's been a long time, but it's one of my favorite topics. So let's see, I'm going to do a screen share. Oops. There we go. So as we go through this presentation, I would like to encourage you to think about what life would have been like in the situations I'm going to talk about, because the events of World War I, the sacrifices people made economically, personally, all led to the Roaring '20s. So let's get started. There we go. So the first thing I like to start out with is a question that I get a lot. Why did the Connecticut State Library take this on? And that's because of this man who was the state librarian at the time. His name was George Seymour Goddard. And he created the Department of War Records at the State Library. He was, as our former state librarian, Ken Wiggin, used to call him, a hoarder. He collected every piece of material he could find about the war. He encouraged the State Council of Defense to have a historic records commission within the Council of Defense that kept every scrap of paper, and I mean scraps of paper, literally, that the Council of Defense created. So this is one of my favorite quotes from him. It came out of the Hartford Courant in 1921, and he's really talking about why he's doing this. In another article, he talks about how if only his grandparents had kept information about the Civil War, just imagine what they would understand, what they would know if all of this information was there. So he wanted to create this for us, literally for our generation, so that we would know what Connecticut has done. And so he's kind of a hero to many of us at the State Library. And I know I saw my former boss is here, so Diane knows exactly what I'm talking about. So Connecticut was a little different as far as the war effort goes. 1914, when the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in 1914 really didn't make the papers here. It wasn't a big deal to most of our nation. It was, you know, a war over there. But here in Connecticut, because of the armaments businesses that we had, because of places like Colt Firearms, we paid attention. By the end of 1914, Colt had multi-million-dollar contracts with the British, the Russians, the Bulgarian, or the Romanians, I'm sorry. And all of those firearms companies were starting to ramp up production. So while the rest of the country wasn't really paying attention, we were, and our economy really started to hum. People started to get involved. And by 1915, by the sinking of the Lusitania, the rest of the country was paying attention. And, you know, there was talk of preparedness. And it was just talk in a lot of the other states. But here in Connecticut, we took it really seriously. We were, by 1916, huge proponents of the preparedness movement that was really kind of pushed by Theodore Roosevelt and his former Secretary of Defense, or Secretary of War, Elihu Root. So this is a front page from the Hartford Courant on June 4th of 1916, which was the day nationwide that people held preparedness parades. And preparedness was really about getting our country ready. We didn't have a standing army like we do today. We had, each state had their own militias, and we had a small army, nothing like what we needed to go to war. And the preparedness movement really believed that we were going to go to war, and we needed to have an army that could actually fight, that we needed soldiers, we needed weapons, we needed uniforms. So this preparedness movement was ramping up, and they created what was called the Plattsburgh Camp, which sent young, usually very educated men up to Plattsburgh, New York, to learn how to become Army officers. This was not a government program. This was funded by wealthy businessmen. Some students paid their own ways, and it really, it helped when it came time to go to war, when it came time to raise that army. We had this corps of officers who could lead the way. So this parade was held on June 4th, 1916. And as you can see, there were 17,000 marching in this parade here in Hartford, with 100,000 spectators. And if I remember correctly, there were about 5,000 Hibernians maybe that didn't make the march because they got lost. So it would have been even larger. New York City held a parade the same day and had 150,000 spectators. So New York City is, I don't know how many times larger than Hartford was, but Hartford drew only 50,000 less than New York. So that gives you an idea of how influential the preparedness movement was here in Connecticut. One of the other things that happened to help push that was the Mexican punitive expedition. This was a response to Pancho Villa, who was the Mexican, I can't think of what he was called at the time. Sorry, it's been that kind of a day. He and his men had assassinated a few, thank you, Cortland. Yes, he was a Mexican revolutionary. He and some of his men, made a raid into Columbus, New Mexico, and there were some civilians and army soldiers who were killed. So the government sent General Pershing down to Mexico with the 1st Division to try and root him out. In the meantime, about 10,000 National Guard troops from all over the country were sent to the Mexican border. Connecticut troops from the 1st and 2nd Connecticut regiments, which date back into the 17th century, were sent to Nogales, Arizona. So this is a picture of some of those Connecticut men on their way to Fort Huachuca on a march. And that's pretty much all they did. They marched and they drilled and they marched and they drilled and they didn't get paid and they had to drink fake beer. And they were there for about 4 months. But Connecticut drilled really hard, and there's a lot of scholars that look at the events of this expedition as really crucial training for what was to come. Again, this is all being led by preparedness, people involved in the preparedness movement. So they came back in October of 1916, and by February of 1917, Marcus Holcomb, who was the governor at the time, decided we needed to be ready. So on February 7th, he commissioned a manpower census. And what he wanted to do was take a census of all of the men between the ages, it was supposed to be 16 and 65, looking at where they worked, what their skills were, because he wanted to be able to protect the men that worked in the ammunition and gun factories. He felt that skilled labor was so important to the war, what he believed was the coming war effort, that he wanted to know where they were, who they were, and protect them. So he commissioned this census. Over 410,000 men were enumerated. The youngest in Weston was a 16-year-old named Stanley Gould, and the oldest was a 94-year-old man named G.W. Downs. The oldest on record was actually 101. He was a man from Avon. As you can see in this example here, they ask, things like, what is your trade or profession, your age, and you can see those red numbers. When this was all done, these forms were coded, and they were actually done at the state library. An entire floor of the state library was kind of a militarized zone where these records were kept and processed. And in this case, you can see this gentleman was a German citizen. So enemy aliens were later sort of separated out, and lists were made of every enemy alien and alien in the state. And we have those records and we have those lists. And it was a way for the state to kind of keep an eye on who was who, and find people if necessary. So there were some other questions like, can you ride a horse? Can you handle a team? This is one of my favorite examples. If the writing is a little hard to read, but this is the census record of William Howard Taft, the former president. He was teaching law at Yale at the time. And this is the best answer on any of these survey questions. Can you do any of the following? Can you ride a horse? And he writes, yes, but it was hard on the horse. For those of you who are familiar with Taft, he was a big man. So we still have all of these census questions, these questionnaires. We have the original cards that were used to tabulate the results. And they are available on ancestry.com if you're interested. They're really fascinating look at occupations and kind of some of the skill sets of people of the day. So because this was so successful, it was done in a period of about 2 months it took to do this. It was all volunteer labor and it cost the state $25,000. Insurance companies donated their time and their machines to read the punch cards. And it really was this absolutely unique thing in the United States. The governor was getting requests for information from states around the country because, you know, people were looking at this going, this is a really good idea. But we were the only ones who did this. And it was so successful that we later did a nursing census, an industrial census that looked at every factory in the state and every mill to see what they could do for war production. Our former curator, Dave Corrigan, is actually working on that and will come out with a database at some point. They did an agricultural census to see who could farm what and how much food production could be done to help not only support the soldiers, but support the state, and a transportation census to see who had cars, trucks, and boats that could be pressed into service if necessary. So this is an example of one of the nursing censuses for Mary Carruthers, who was originally from Weston. And one of the questions they would ask is, you know, are you willing to volunteer to work for the war effort? And are you willing to go overseas? So these censuses were so important that even Theodore Roosevelt weighed in and said that he feels every decent American in this country is under a heavy debt of obligation to Governor Holcomb and the people of Connecticut for what the state has done. And that is Marcus Holcomb pictured there. So that all led to preparations over here. And again, Connecticut was really sort of unique in that we had one of the strongest Council of Defenses in the country. There was a National Council of Defense that kind of oversaw the messaging and the propaganda that was going to kind of sell the war to the American people. And here in Connecticut, we had our own Council of Defense. Each state had one, and it was made up of a number of different committees on food, Americanization, women's activities, fuel, Americanization. This is one of the Be an American huts that stood around the country, or around the state, that taught English language to immigrants in the state. So that was a really big part of the Council of Defense push. And like I mentioned earlier, there was a lot of manufacturing. We made everything literally from artillery to Zeppelins. Bridgeport in 1918 alone, through Remington Arms and United Metallic Cartridge, produced 2 billion 30-06 shells and 1.2 billion rounds of other ammunition. And that's just Bridgeport. Connecticut was a powerhouse in this. It is, I've read a few different numbers, but it's generally thought that about 50% of the small arms ammunition used by the American Army or by the AEF was produced right here in Connecticut. Gas masks like this were also produced here, and that actually became a society thing. The Hartford Rubber Works were producing gas masks, and that's where society ladies went to work. It was considered good work for society girls. The Council of Defense in 1918, to really kind of push the manufacturing, set up this exhibition hall at the Connecticut State Fair in what's now West Hartford. And they created this war exhibits, which showcased all of the things made here in Connecticut. There were submarines, there were Zeppelins, there were all sorts of fabric type things like grenade belts, belt buckles, as you can see, tents, ponchos, you name it, it was created here. I looked to see if Weston had any industry and couldn't find anything. I'm sure there was some sort of war effort happening. So the other piece of this was getting people involved. You had this incredible manufacturing process happening here in the state, but we also needed men to sign up to go to war, and we needed funding because the government didn't have the funding to pay for the army, to pay for the materials we needed, to pay for the artillery. So they created a Liberty Loan campaigns to get people to subscribe and pay $50 towards the war, and then they'd get $55 back 3 years later. So this is one of the war rallies that was held, which, you know, in the days of COVID now, looking at that is kind of scary. But in 1917, 1918, when these rallies were being held, they were almost mandatory. That census that was done allowed the state to know where everyone was and kind of allowed some peer pressure. There were records of people not registering for that census, not coming to rallies for Liberty loans. If you didn't buy a Liberty loan, a Liberty bond, you were looked down upon, you were shunned. There's stories of a man in Meriden who was forced to withdraw his child from school because he would not allow her to buy a Liberty bond. So the pressure was intense on people. And they held more sort of fun events like this tank. They remodeled Pope Park in Hartford to show off this British tank to people, to show kind of what the power was. And again, it was used as a mechanism to not only sell the war, but sell Liberty bonds. And then in towns across the state, they set up these Liberty Bond cottages. This one is in Hartford in front of the old State House. There's still one in Waterbury. It's standing in, I forget what park, over by the Brass Mill Mall. And they were used by all sorts of different groups for different funds. If it wasn't a Liberty Loan campaign going on, there was a Knights of Columbus War Fund, or a war savings stamp, or a Red Cross fund drive. There was always something you should be giving your time or money to. And if you didn't, you were really shunned in this state. In other states, there was much more anti-war sentiment that happened, and it was in some places almost accepted. Here, it was not. If you didn't take part in the war effort in whatever way you were able, you were shunned. You were a pariah. You were anti-American. And that propaganda selling you that stuff was everywhere. This is a window display from C.S. Hill's, which was a department store in Hartford. And this kind of stuff is what you saw everywhere you went. When you went to the butcher shop, you saw these posters. You read it in the newspaper every day. You saw it in advertising. It was all encompassing. The war was all encompassing. And it was also the place that women made their mark. This was a watershed moment for women. I mean, women had been making strides, but this is really where they stepped up. As you can see from this quote from a Hartford Current article about women learning how to fix and drive ambulances, the reporter noted that this was going to give women the opportunity to be more economically secure and independent than ever before. And this is one of my favorite pictures. This is Mrs. Mary Hart of Hartford. She was the first female railroad gate tender. They actually had people with stop signs at these railroad crossings to make sure that, you know, cars or horse buggies or people didn't cross when the trains were coming. And it's interesting to see how newspapers covered the role of women in the war at the time. They mentioned her stature, her clothing, and her looks, and kind of intimated that she was perfect for the job because of those things. What was really interesting about Mary Hart is that she drew the same pay as men. So 100 years ago, there was some income equality at this point. And she drew a wage of $1.75 for an 11 to 12-hour shift, which she worked 7 days a week with every other Sunday off. But women were involved in a whole host of other things. This is inside the Liberty Loan Cottage in Hartford, and they are doing, I think this was actually a second round of the nurses survey. And this is a group of women ambulance drivers, and they were taught how to not only drive an ambulance, but how to fix an ambulance. And there was a whole corps of women that went over to France with their own ambulances to drive whatever missions they were allowed. Women did clerical work. This is part of the State Library and the Department of War Records. And you can see them filing and kind of taking care of all of those records that we created. And there were all sorts of Liberty Loan committees. This is a Greek Women's Liberty Loan Committee that really were out there selling the bonds, and Connecticut oversubscribed to every single Liberty Loan committee or every single Liberty Loan campaign. There were 5 in total. And even the 4th Liberty Loan campaign, which took place in the midst of the flu pandemic, they still managed to oversubscribe, meaning they raised more money than they needed to. Each state was given a quota of how much they had to raise, and Connecticut went over every single time. This is one of my favorite stories. These are the Hello Girls, and they were bilingual switchboard operators. They trained here in Hartford. There was this group of, there were originally 18 women that trained in Hartford, and a few of them saw service in France. They also served on the front lines. This is one of my favorite stories because they are very connected to the Connecticut story and the Connecticut soldiers. These are the Salvation Army donut lassies. And there were 2 cousins. Oh my God, I am really losing it today. From Manchester, the Turkington sisters, who are, one of them is pictured here, the woman sort of whose face is obscured by a soldier. And this is just south of where our soldiers were in SEICHEPREY. And I'll show you, I'll talk about that in a second. And this is another photo of them making donuts for Connecticut soldiers. So in order to put all of the work that people were doing here in Connecticut together and to make it count for something, you know, we have to look at what was happening over there as well. Like I mentioned earlier, there was not enough men for the Army. So these kind of recruiting flags went up all over Connecticut. Tents were set up in almost every single town in the state to start recruiting men for the Connecticut National Guard or the Army. Connecticut National Guard held parades to recruit, and people like the men in the straw hats behind would just sort of fall in line to go serve. We didn't have the white feather campaign like they did in England. Anyone who's watched Downton Abbey is familiar with the white feather. If you were given a white feather, that meant you were a coward because you should be in uniform and you weren't. But there was a lot of pressure even here to enlist. And we have all sorts of records of men rushing out to enlist because they didn't want the shame of being drafted. Camps like this were set up in several places in the summer and spring and summer of 1917 to get kind of that camp mentality together, to come together as a cohesive unit and to train. And on June 5th of 1917 was the first draft. And this is where Selective Service Act of today comes from. One of my theories in having studied the manpower census that I talked about earlier is that the way this draft happened nationwide was actually based on what Connecticut had done. There's a lot of correspondence and trips being made by the men involved in the manpower census down to DC to talk to the draft board to kind of formulate how this should be done. And on June 5th of 1917, every man between the ages of 21 and 31, I think it was, had to register for the draft. In Hartford, there were so many people that they had to press these trolley cars into service as draft stations. And then you would see scenes like this, which are a contingent of drafted men getting ready to ship out. And then they would parade through whatever city they were leaving from to the train station so that they could embark to whatever training camp they were going to. Most of the Connecticut men went to Camp Devens or to Camp Upton in New York, Camp Devens up in Massachusetts. So once those soldiers were drafted or enlisted into the service, they started going over in June of 1917, the Connecticut National Guard troops, which was part of the 26th Division, and Connecticut National Guard, that 1st and 2nd Regiment became the 102nd, participated in every American engagement. So we had Connecticut soldiers at every engagement, including in Vittorio Veneto in Italy in fall of 1918. And if you participated in those battles, you would get this victory medal, as you can see here, with different clasps. And this one belonged to a man from Berlin. So the battle that I focus on, and it would take me too long to talk about all of those battles, the battle I focus on is SEICHEPREY. This was a very Connecticut-centric battle. It was the first German offensive against American troops. It happened on April 20th of 1918 in this tiny little village of SEICHEPREY. And if you can notice, kind of on the left-hand side, off in the distance, there's sort of a large hill that's called Mont Sec. The Germans held that and could see everything from there. You can see absolutely everything for 100 miles around from up there. So Connecticut troops were based here in SEICHEPREY and in the woods that you see right there in the picture. And at about 3 o'clock in the morning, about 600 Connecticut troops were surrounded by 3,500 German troops, including some of the fiercest warriors they had called the Stormtroopers. They surrounded our troops with a box barrage. So they laid down heavy artillery fire, kind of cutting everything off. And more than 81 Connecticut men were killed. Another roughly 400 of those were wounded, and 130 were captured. This is the defining battle for Connecticut. I was told by a French historian who works at the Verdun Museum that there's a story there that when the Marines went into battle at Bois de Belleau, at Belleau Wood, that they cried, "This is for SEICHEPREY." The war artist Harry Everett Townsend, who wasn't even from Connecticut at the time, writes throughout his diary about the effect that SEICHEPREY had on the troops. By some accounts, it was a failure. We lost the town for a little while before we got it back. By some, it was a win. It depends on kind of what school of thought you belong to. Either way you look at it, it had a huge effect on the people of Connecticut. These are a few. This is a before the scenes photo of what was the chateau in the town. and this is after the battle. This is a street scene from after the battle. The little bit of the town that was standing was completely destroyed. The trenches in SEICHEPREY were in mud and water up to the hips. So the picture on the left is from 1918, from when our boys were there. And the picture on the right is from when I was there in spring of 2018. So I spent some time there. I got to know them, and you'll see in a second the results of that. So our men were there from, for the most part, the early part of 1918 to November of 1918. We stayed until 1919, but really the active battle period was only about 6 months. And we lost more than 121,000 men in those 6 months. It was a devastating war. It was full of new technology. This is the first war that had tanks or airplanes, chemical weapons, really sort of machine guns. It was a war like we had never seen. And that had a profound effect, not only on the soldiers, but on the people back home, which is one of those things, the fear that people felt is, I think, one of those things that led to the 20s and led to just a sigh of relief. So when we finally came home, when soldiers finally started coming home to Connecticut, it was 1919, and they came home to a hero's welcome. This is a well-known photo, and hopefully you guys know who the dog is. If not, that is Sergeant Stubby. He was a stray dog from New Haven who was adopted by a New Britain soldier. He was smuggled to France. He was wounded at Seicheprey, and he became the most decorated dog in military history. He is currently stuffed, sort of, at the Smithsonian Museum of American History, where he sits next to the pigeon Cher-Ami, who played a huge role in the Lost Battalion. So this is Stubby on April 30th of 1919 at the Welcome Home Parade in Hartford. And he's being walked by sort of his companion, Robert Conroy, J. Robert Conroy. Once the guys came home, they came home to a very different economy. A lot of the jobs that they had were gone. A lot of the wounds that they came home with prevented them from working in the same jobs that they had. So one of the things that we did as the state library is we created this service questionnaire. We were one of 4 states that created these. And the scholar who actually wrote a book on these, Ed Gutierrez, believes that the other states that did questionnaires based theirs on what we did. They were sent to every man and woman who served, and more than 13,000 were returned. So this is for Robert Alexander Wilson, who was a Weston soldier. And the first page is really just about who they were. The second page starts their war record and talks, when they were enlisted or inducted, where they trained, where they left from. And then when we're lucky, they include a picture of themselves. The third page is also the war record, and it talks about, any citations they received, wounds, or whether they were killed in action. If they were killed in action, oftentimes a family member filled these out with what they knew and sent pictures. In this case, he was wounded in the leg and right hip by machine gun fire. And the last page is really the interesting one when they fill it out. One of the questions asks, if you took part in the fighting, what impressions were made upon you by this experience? One of my favorite answers has to do with the fact that the gentleman, Ray Queenan, stopped being afraid of death because he saw death all around him. What he feared most was how his family back home would receive news of his death. So there's some incredibly profound answers that are given in these questionnaires. They're fascinating to look at, and they are also available on Ancestry. Most towns had a wooden honor roll erected during the war that listed everyone in town who was serving in any capacity, whether it was with the YMCA, the Red Cross, or within one of the branches of service. I don't have a picture of Weston's. I do have this picture of the honor roll that was eventually put up. And World War I is really the one war that almost every town has a dedicated monument just for that war. A lot of these were put up by the American Legion, which was formed in 1919 by the World War I soldiers. And it was a way, these were a way to remember those who served. This is one of my favorite guys. He, Albert Rossignol, and Paul Maynard were both killed on November 11th, the morning of the day the war ended. Their commander made them go into battle, even though he knew the war was ending in a little over an hour. They were killed at about 9:30 in the morning. So I just ask that you never forget. So all of this sort of work that I've done kind of coalesced into this project that we conceived of in 2014 called Remembering World War I, Sharing History, Preserving Memories, where we went into communities all over the state, including we went to Westport Library, we went to Wilton Library, and we asked you to come in to bring us your stuff. We scanned it, we collected stories, and we are working on getting it online. It's been a labor of love for me for many years. I'm the only person still working on this. So if you have participated and you're wondering where your stuff is, it's coming. I promise. I have not forgotten. During the course of 46 events, we've collected more than 450 stories. We preserved more than 1,500 objects digitally and created more than 5,000 digital images. So I am in the process of creating the kind of information about all that stuff that needs to be there before we can put it online. And that led us to digging into history, the project that Samantha mentioned earlier. And I'm just going to kind of run through this. In 2019, I took a group of 15 Connecticut high school students from all over the state back to SEICHEPREY to restore those trenches that you saw earlier, as an act of kind of rekindling a friendship that had existed between Connecticut and SEICHEPREY 100 years ago. So these students, got to experience what life was like. I'm going to skip past that. We found these kind of things like this spoon with a bullet hole. The bullet was not in it. Philippe kind of put that there to show us what it really was. I had a student write his college essay on that spoon. We think that what likely happened was that a soldier held that spoon up over the top of the trench to check for snipers. And obviously there was a sniper there. The kids had an amazing time and they did absolutely stunning work. This is what we started with. This was the shelter. On day 1, we started clearing it out. That's day 3. And this is what they accomplished by day 7. It was absolutely amazing. The kids did all of the work themselves. We had a group of military historians supervising the work, and it was an absolutely amazing and life-changing trip. So this is the group of kids. We had 15 Connecticut students and 16 French students, and we were there for 3 weeks. You can read more about it on our website and our Facebook page. So this is the Connecticut fountain that was installed in 1923. And this is our students with that on the last day we were in SEICHEPREY. Which brings me to what's next. As I mentioned before, we are working on completing that digital archive. We're using a new system to do that, and hopefully by this summer we should be done. We are reprising Digging into History. We were supposed to be bringing the French students here to Connecticut last summer to do an archaeological excavation of one of the Rochambeau French army camps here in Connecticut. COVID put a stop to that, but we are hopeful that we'll be able to do it next summer, so summer of 22. So we're always looking for help with that. Follow us on social media and you'll learn more about that. And then we started planning for Connecticut and SEICHEPREY 2023. So this is really exciting. We're gonna be rededicating that fountain. And we are also looking to install a Sergeant Stubby statue in France. We have one here in Connecticut in Middletown, and we're really hopeful that we're going to be able to do this absolutely gorgeous sculpture in France, done by Susan Bahari, who has done sculptures and monuments around the country, around the world, really. She is phenomenal. We're hopefully going to be getting lots of people to France to help us celebrate 2023. So with that, I am done. I flew through this. I skipped a ton because there's just not enough time to talk about everything, but I would love to hear questions. I would love to hear your stories. If you have someone that fought in World War I that you would like to add to our digital archive, please let me know. Shoot me an email. I am working from home, so calling that number is not going to, I'm not going to get back to you immediately. But thank you for having me, and thank you for putting up with the Zoom presentation. It's much better in person, I promise.
Christine, thank you so much. I'm waiting for questions to come in. A lot of excellent presentations, but earlier on when people were kind of jumping into the meeting room, a lot of people were saying that they had family members, and I don't know if you can see the chat, bless you. But there were a lot of people that mentioned grandfathers. One woman mentioned, her name is Heidi. She said her grandfather was in the 102nd Infantry. Ellen mentioned that her grandfather fought in Verdun. Jim had mentioned his father drove a truck in France for World War I. He was in the 3rd Division. Someone from New Fairfield mentioned that both her grandfathers fought in World War I, and they were from the Buffalo area. So we have a lot of people who have a connection to this war. Judy mentioned her grandfather, Ernest Joseph Jagera. He was in World War I. She believes he's at home. So we have a lot of people connected to it.
And we're really lucky. Connecticut has a ton of resources to help you find your ancestors. In about 1941, the Connecticut National Guard and the state published the service records of the men and women who fought in the Great War. And it is a town by town listing of, I can't say everyone, but most of the people that they had record of that fought in the war. And it will tell you when and where they were born, what their serial number, which was sort of their army number, was, when they enlisted, where they were, whether they were wounded or killed. It's a great resource. And I do believe there's a link to it on our website, on the CT and World War I website.
Fantastic. So we have some questions coming in. The first one is from Mary. She's age 9, and she asks you, Christine, did any of your family members fight in World War I?
I did. I had a lot of great uncles. My great grandfather had just gotten out of the army when the war started, and he had 4 children by that point, so he did not go. And my other great grandfather was too old, but I had a lot of my great uncles served, and some of them actually served in the 102nd in the kind of regiment that I study. So I was able to follow his footsteps when I went to France in 2018, which was really, really cool.
Wow, what an impact that must have made for you and your family to sort of bring that history home.
Yeah, yeah.
Heidi wanted to mention, she wanted to confirm that yes, her grandfather did fight in CHESPREY, and he lost his left leg. So,
Oh,
um,
what was his name?
well, Heidi, what was your grandfather's name? Type that in, and Christine will hopefully look that up for us. Kathy has a question. What happened to recent immigrants who had families during that time?
Um, so the recent immigrants, a lot of the men actually turned around and went off to war, which we've got a number of men that we've profiled that had come in 1916, like from Italy, and by 1917 they were right back in France. Immigration was a little bit different then, so immigrants that stayed here, were able to work unless you were a German citizen. Things were a lot tougher if you were German, but as long as you weren't from one of what were considered the enemy alien countries, you got to just pretty much live your life. Like I showed that picture of the Greek Women's Liberty Loan Committee, there were sort of ethnic communities that popped up that worked on all sorts of different war efforts, relief efforts, especially for European immigrants. And, for the German immigrants, life was tough here in Connecticut. It was very difficult. There were restrictions. You couldn't live within a half mile of any factory that was producing war goods. You had to register as an enemy alien, and if you went outside of your prescribed routes, which was basically from where you live to where you work and back, you could be arrested. And there was a case of a Hartford man who asked permission to go to New York. He was denied. He went anyways, and upon his return to Hartford, he was arrested, jailed, and later transferred to Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, as a dangerous enemy alien. So it was a tough place to be if you were a German or Austrian.
Wow. A question from Skip. Was there a process to identify men or women who were important to making war material and giving them deferments from military duty?
And that was what really that manpower census was. It was to protect them. However, the state really had to fight the War Department to actually defer their drafting. They did a pretty good job. The War Department realized just how important that manufacturing sector was. But I don't think anybody's ever really studied the effect that the draft had on manufacturing. I know here in Connecticut, we were pretty safe because of that census. The draft boards were able to say, hey, this person works in such and such a factory, we need him. And they were, for the most part, pretty successful in protecting them and protecting the manufacturing power of those industries.
Kathy has a question. She asks, what happened in Connecticut during the influenza pandemic that occurred at the same time? I know that's kind of a big question there.
Yeah, Connecticut didn't do as badly as Philadelphia, but it didn't do as well as Missouri. Philadelphia just sort of let everything go. They took no precautions. Missouri took stronger precautions. Connecticut was right about in the middle. We because we had that very strong Council of Defense, they got involved and they worked with the Board of Health and the health inspectors to kind of put that propaganda effort that they had towards keeping people safe during the pandemic. So the State Library has a whole series of reports on the flu pandemic of 1918, and you can see the precautions that they were suggesting. You know, wearing a mask, washing your hands, not going out in public. We really scaled back a lot of those Fourth Liberty Zone activities. So we weren't hit as badly as other places, but we still suffered like everyone else. And about a third of our soldiers from Connecticut that died in the war died from the flu.
Wow, I wasn't aware it was that many.
Yeah.
Wow. Heidi Cannon, she mentioned her grandfather's name is John R. Cannon. So there you go.
If you'd like to email me, I can give you, because he was 102nd, I can give you more information almost immediately.
All right, Heidi. So please reach out to Christine. Her email is on the screen. Vicky asks, how can we make a donation to support your future projects?
I believe on our on the CT and World War I website, there's still a place to donate to the Digging into History project. We are going to be needing, we'll be doing fundraising as we get closer, but we're bringing the kids here this time. When we went to France, we did a lot of fundraising, but the French government paid for all of their housing, transportation, meals, and activities while we were in SEICHEPREY. So we have to sort of return the favor when they come here. So yeah, go to our website and go to the Digging into History page. I think it's the Digging into History page. And there's a mechanism there where you can donate to the project. So thank you.
Fantastic. Now, Heidi was wondering, are students only going, it sounds like French students are coming here in 2022.
Yeah.
Now, is there a way for adults to help out? Is there a way for adults to volunteer?
Not yet. We've talked about trying to do something like that. We are in the process of putting together a tour in France. It'll be like a 10-day to 2-week tour of the 102nd in France. So, keep an eye out on our social media for that as we go forward. We're going to be doing a survey within the next couple months to see if people would be interested, what they'd be interested in seeing. So we can kind of work on making that a good tour. So
that's exciting. Mike asked, aside from SEICHEPREY, what were the next biggest battles with a large Connecticut representation?
So Chateau Thierry in July of 1918, we lost more men at Chateau Thierry than we did at SEICHEPREY. And it was more than just Connecticut that was involved in that. And then Saint-Mihiel, which was in September of 1918. We were involved in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, which was the battle that ended the war. It's the last 47 days of the war. But we weren't as involved as some of the other divisions. General Pershing had a dislike of General Edwards, who was the commander of the 26th Division, and removed him from command in the midst of the Meuse-Argonne and kind of sidelined the 26th a little bit during that battle. But really, outside of SEICHEPREY, it would have been Chateau Thierry and Saint-Mihiel. The one other interesting thing about the 26th Division and Connecticut troops, we're the only division that spent time up in the caves in France, in northern France, I'm sorry, up near Soissons and Rennes. And we spent 2 months living in these underground quarries. I just did a story for Connecticut, the last issue of Connecticut Explored, that, I used the soldiers' words with pictures that I took in the caves of their graffiti on the walls. So check that out if you're interested.
Please do. I highly recommend it. excellent article.
Thank you.
Cortland wants to give you a shout out. She just wants, or he or she wants to say, I just want to say that the commemorative groups in other states were in awe of what Christine was able to pull off with the SEICHEPREY Trench Project. So you should
Thank you,
all be
Court.
proud.
I'm trying to drag Cortland and California into that project. So
wonderful. Just going through, Diane says, so glad that Christine is working so hard to record and recover Connecticut World War I history. So a lot of people giving thanks. Just want to make sure that I'm not missing anything. Elizabeth said she made up a poem for Veterans Day last year, and a retired veteran came to her school. This is the 9-year-old.
yeah,
This year, my teacher's son is in the military. So she says, thank you. Actually, her name is Mary. And she says she's very interested in history. So who knows, maybe down the road, she'll be one of your high school students that continue
yeah. And
on.
you know what? I would also suggest as she gets older to keep an eye out for History Day, which is an amazing statewide project that allows you to dig into a topic in history that you're really interested in.
Excellent, excellent suggestion. So I believe I'm just kind of scrolling through the questions one more time, but I believe we have answered everybody's questions. Heidi Cannon, she did mention that if you go to her Facebook page, she has a picture of her grandfather on her Facebook page. So that is good to know. So I believe that sums it up. So Christine, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and sharing your time with us this evening. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening. And if you enjoyed tonight's presentation and you'd like to see more virtual programming from the Weston Historical Society, please consider a donation or a membership, and you can visit our website, westonhistoricalsociety.org. And for those who are local to Weston, we encourage you to visit the Historical Society. We're at the Coley Homestead at 104 Weston Road. And there we have just installed an outdoor museum. So we've installed historic interpretive signage so that allows you to sort of learn the history of the property, the buildings, as well as the people who lived at the Coley Homestead. And please visit our website for upcoming events. We will, on March 9th, we have Rago, which is a leading auction house. They've been featured on Antiques Roadshow. They're going to be holding their second jewelry appraisal and consignment day at the Weston Historical Society. All COVID restrictions will be in place. So visit our website to learn how you can make an appointment for that. So once again, Christine, thank you so much. And everyone, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, my pleasure, our pleasure. And once again, this recording will be up in a few days on our website. So I am going to end the meeting now. Thank you all for coming tonight. Bye-bye.
Bye.